So as most of you probably know by now, yesterday XXXTentacion was murdered in Deerfield Beach, which is weird because it's like right around the corner from us. And this video is going to be obviously a little bit more off the cuff and not as produced. We talked about doing a video on it, and I think that just kind of speaking to you guys directly and being honest is sort of the best way to approach this kind of thing. His death is obviously a very polarizing thing. I think when you talk about people like XXXTentacion, it's very hard to not get into that art versus artist kind of debate, and I'm not here to do that right now. But I think that to not mention that is kind of counterintuitive when you talk about these kind of things, because a lot of who X was as a person came out through his music and through his art, and I think a lot of that resonated with a lot of people, which is why I think his death is so polarizing, because a lot of people felt him and a lot of people saw themselves not only in his music but through him as an individual. And I think that's something that's important to acknowledge going forward. Now, I get it. Look, when you talk about XXX, you have to acknowledge a lot of the things that he's done. You can't really scroll down on Facebook without somebody acknowledging, hey, we shouldn't be respecting this person. He's, you know, he beat his pregnant ex-girlfriend, which is true, and that's something that we need to acknowledge. And I'm by no means saying that that's excusable. That is disgusting human behavior, and especially having come from abuse myself, it's one of those things that it's despicable. You don't want to apologize for it. You never want to give that kind of context, but at the same time, you have to acknowledge that a human being is dead. Wilkie is definitely more versed on sort of like the music scene than I am. He's been studying this his whole life. I mean, that's his area of expertise. So he's definitely somebody who's going to be a little bit more versed when talking about sort of a lot of the intricacies of his career and sort of how it existed within the context of the music scene, especially in Miami. You know, especially sort of the Florida music scene. It's something that he would be definitely better at voicing than I would. And being from Miami, again, for us, it, in a weird way, it hits close to home because it is part of your sort of geographical culture. Like it sort of falls into that, you know, I guess home pride, I guess, you know, and you know, again, us being musicians and music fans, you know, you root for those around you, and you root for art in your area to thrive. And when you hear something like this, it does sort of feel like a defeat. And again, you feel kind of weird for feeling that way because of the person he was and because it's so polarizing. But it's just one of those things that you can't necessarily help. And you know, I think for a lot of people, they're sort of in that same boat. You know, you have a lot of his fans who want to sympathize, who want to mourn somebody who made art for them, essentially, who reflected who they were, and yet you're acknowledging that somebody who has a history of domestic abuse that's still not necessarily settled. He was still, you know, that was still an ongoing thing for him. You know, that never got to see closure, and that sort of is his legacy. And he wouldn't be the first person to, you know, he wouldn't be the first shitty person, if you will, to make great art and yet, you know, sort of go before his time. And now, how are we supposed to remember him? That's a thing that's been going on throughout history. And I think to have that debate now is sort of mute, because that's not the point. You know, we could talk back and forth all day long about who was, you know, like is this person's art relevant, even though they were this kind of person. You know, should the morality behind enjoying someone's art based on the kind of person they were, like, that's a whole different debate for a different video. And quite frankly, to talk about it now is pointless, because to me, it's mute. The bottom line here is say what you will, you know, acknowledge his faults, acknowledge who he was as an individual, but acknowledge everything. Acknowledge that yes, he was a shitty person. He was somebody who had his faults, and he did despicable, disgusting things. You know, but also acknowledge that as an artist, as a human, he did give a shit. He did care, and his art was very honest in that regards, and his art means something to people. You know, I guess if there's anything, you know, if there's anything that really bothers me about the situation, is that I think that we all need to kind of take a step back and look at X for who he really was. You know, and I'm not saying don't acknowledge, you know, the things that he's done, but at least respect him enough in death, because it's easy to forget that this was, again, still a human being, you know, who was murdered. You know, at least respect him enough to talk about him as a human being. At least respect him enough to have a discussion about who he was, rather than a political stance on why, you know, on why we as a society fucking idolize abusers and shit like that. Like, no, like, people do things for a reason. People feel things for a reason. It's human. Let that be. And I think that that's important to acknowledge. And especially with the internet, being a collection of anonymous voices, the shittiest parts of people is going to come out. That's expected. I get that. But at the same time, you know, I feel it's important to acknowledge somebody's humanity regardless of how awful they were as a person. Acknowledge that, by all means, yes. Talk about it. Talk about how talk about the things they've done wrong, but do it in a way that's respectful. You know, I think we're better than this. And not that this stupid video is gonna stop all the memes or people having opinions, or your friends on Facebook sharing articles about why he's a shitty person. But at the very least, with the discussion that we try to have, and the discussion that we sort of try to have on our end, you know, let's have a genuine conversation about him as an individual. I mean, I don't really know what else to say other than it's just so, it's such a shocking thing, and, like, you know, you don't know how to go about saying, you know, how about talking about this without pissing somebody off. But what do you guys think? You know, I mean, like, when you heard this, what was your kind of initial gut reaction? And moreover, how do you think he's going to be remembered? And how do you think, you know, what do you think his legacy is going to be, you know, going forward? I'm interested because, again, we have our opinions, but we come from different places than everyone else, I guess. And I'm also an incredibly understanding individual, and being somebody whose work is essentially get drunk and document things, I'm going to have a very different perspective than most people out there. So I'm curious to see what the general public thinks. You know, am I stupid? You know, is it wrong? Is it wrong for me to think that this individual should be at least respected in death, enough to have a general conversation? Or, you know, is it right to write off somebody's entire life based off one disgusting thing that they did? And I don't necessarily have an answer to that. You know, I don't. That's what's so polarizing, and I think that issue is not going to go away anytime soon. I mean, it's been a thing for more than ever, and I think now, again, with things like the internet, you're going to find people who, again, we need to remember, are human beings who have flaws, and those flaws and those histories and those past may or may not catch up to them in different ways. You know, what does that say for their art? More importantly, what does that say for the way that they relate to everyone else? And that's something that I myself, again, don't have any answers towards. I'm curious to see what you guys think. So I guess with that being said, you know, I mean, take a shot, pour one out, or not. You know, just let us know what you think in the comments below, I guess. And we'll see you this Friday. So, yeah.
Okay, so regarding the entire XXXTentacion situation, so especially on social media and on Twitter as well as on Facebook, there's been a lot of back and forth regarding, you know, like how people view this entire occurrence of the death of XXX. So on one side, I'm seeing, you know, all the fans, his friends, family mourning over the passing of this guy, and then on the other hand, I see all these people who are hardcore haters of XXX. Pretty much, the reason I can see why they would hate him, because of the fact that he was kind of a piece of shit person, especially when he was younger. He was known to beat up his jail. When he was in jail, he beat up his cellmate because he was gay and was like checking him out. He beat up his girlfriend. He like tortured her, kept her like against her will in his home, and just did some awful, horrible shit to her. And then if that wasn't enough, then his toxic fan base literally goes out of their way to attack her when she was trying to start a GoFundMe to get money to get surgery for her eye, which was fucked up by XXX. So here's my 2 cents regarding the entire situation. As a human being, I think XXXTentacion was a horrible person. Horrible, horrible, terrible person. I've heard a lot of the stories, a lot of the rumors, not just from online, but from mutual friends that both him and I have. And it's always been the same thing. And I've also heard, the same exact rumors that, his girlfriend was exaggerating, she was lying about the situation. But I'm going to take her side in this context. So I think he was a pretty shitty person, but even as of late, he was showing signs of actually wanting to change and trying to be a better person. And I think it even in his music, his growth starts to show. So just to summarize, I think he was a shitty person, but as an artist, I have a lot of respect for him. He was able to impact a lot of people in a positive way, even though his music wasn't always positive. But I see a lot of these like millennials, I guess would be the best way, not just millennials, but Generation Z, kids that would be suffering from depression, saying that his music helped save them from being in a darker state because they related in such a way. So I mourn, not really so much for him as a person, but I mourn for his fans, for his friends, for his family, who he really left a positive impact on. Because that's one positive experience that's just lost in the world.